Welcome to the Supply Chain Pioneers podcast, where we highlight industry leaders on the forefront of innovation and technology in planning, procurement, and logistics. Hosted by your supply chain pro to know, Ulf Venn.
Supply Chain Pioneers is powered by Everstream Analytics. Everstream gives you the predictive insights and analytics to make your supply chain faster, smarter, safer, and leaner. Go to everstream.ai to book your demo today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Supply Chain Pioneers. And with me today, I have Chris Wright, who is the CEO and founder of scmBLOX. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Ulf. Thanks for having me. I've seen several of these podcasts, and it's great to be on one now. And yes, I'm co-founder and CEO of scmBLOX, Supply Chain Management Blocks. Born and raised in Dallas, Texas. I'm in the United States. I actually met my wife in kindergarten, so we've known each other a long time. For education, I went to school. My bachelor's is aerospace engineering from MIT, and then went to University of Michigan for a master's in industrial engineering. I'm actually still in school right now doing a doctorate of business administration, DBA. Got two daughters. We're empty nesters. They're older now. One's in Brooklyn, New York. One's in Austin, Texas. So we're empty nesters. My wife is a senior pastor in the United Methodist Church. And here I am. That's my quick story.
That's good. And we go through the rest of the story during this podcast, actually, because it's a pretty interesting one. So let's start at the beginning after your first time graduating, which was you started essentially first in quality management.
That's true.
But then you made quite a shift into supply chain. And my first question just has to be, how does somebody go from quality management to supply chain?
It's a good question. And for me, it seems like a real easy path. Always been drawn to or gravitate toward processes and systems. And I feel like I've always appreciated the long-term strategic kind of high-level view of things. So I'm a firm believer in letting the system and the process, whatever, do all the heavy lifting. And we're part of that process, but the process needs to be designed to do that. So I got into quality. If you're familiar with Lean and Six Sigma, I'm a Lean Sensei, a Six Sigma Master Black Belt. But it all started, I didn't know if we talk about this, but for me, it all started with this book, Edwards Deming, Out of the Crisis. That's a big book to read when you're in, this is decades ago when I was entering the quality field. And he talks about a system being a network of interdependent components that work together to accomplish the aim of a system. But he makes comments like, a bad system will be a good person every time. And I love that. And something to the effect of the system is responsible for 94% of the problems. And so people individually are not that big of a contribution. So that got me really appreciating systems more. And then from there, I moved my next favorite book. So if anyone ever asks, what are your favorite books? My next one is The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. And he introduces the concept of systems thinking. And it comes from a field called system dynamics. And he introduces the beer game, which some people in the supply chain world may be familiar with, but talks about that, introduces this concept that the structure of the system drives its behavior. And like I said, introduces system dynamics. That got me reading even more. And so then my next favorite book is Industrial Dynamics by Jay Forrester. That came out in like 1961. I think his initial article came out in 1958 in the Harvard Business Review. Then that book came from. And in that book is where he actually stimulates this industrial production distribution system, which becomes the beer game. And so that's my flow from quality into systems into production and distribution.
Oh, that's very interesting. And it's a good storyline, actually. I love it. So obviously you stayed in supply chain for a while, but then you made another pivot, and it has to do with one of the books maybe, because you talked about crisis already. Mm-hmm. And then your next station in your life was risk. So you were vice president for operational risk management in a bank, in the Bank of America, actually, the bank. And you build a risk framework there. So for you, what were because it's very early on and the concept of risk wasn't everywhere like super public, but what were some of the key components of your framework that you built 22 years ago? And what how would you improve the framework right now, or would it still stand the test of time?
That's a good question. Interesting. I think it would stand the test of time. Or the framework that we developed for technology and operational risk at the bank. So looking at processes again, and the way operations, the way the bank operated, the technology that was used. So it was very quality oriented, which means it was very process oriented. So it built off the background that I had. For example, we used what's called FMEA, failure mode and effects analysis, is one of our big tools for measuring risk. And if you look, it has a score risk priority number. So some of this was already being done, and we just used that tool. And what I really liked about that tool, a lot of times when people think of risk, they think of how bad is it, the severity in the FMEA, and how often does it happen or does it occur? What's the probability of occurrence? But with the FMEA, they also bring in detection, which is a function of the system and the process. And so all that was just playing on things that I already naturally believed in. And it was easy to build that out and to have this systems orientation to risk management.
It's perfect. You then went and built a simulation system and focused on data and analytics afterwards, probably also because you started the thinking of the system again.
Yeah.
So why did you change in the technology space after doing operational risk management?
Well, yeah, this is just interesting when I think about how it all flows together. So again, that was very quality oriented what we were doing. And so soon after that, I became the manager of TQM, Total Quality Management. That's old school, for Raytheon, which is a large defense contractor. That's about the time I was reading the fifth discipline and all that. So the fifth discipline talks about systems thinking, system dynamics in the beer game, and system dynamic simulation. So I started to get into simulation to help me understand. Again, I was manager of TQM, Total Quality Management, to help me understand all these process improvements that we were trying to do. Would they really work? Because I found from my experience, there were some projects that we just thought would be the best and make all these great improvements. And they did okay. They weren't huge improvements. They were all right. And then there were these little projects where we thought, we're just doing something. It's not going to be anything major. And it ended up being this huge improvement. So I wanted to better understand how the changes we were making, instead of just having it in on paper, a flow chart on paper, here's the current version, here's the future version. And yeah, we're looking at those. I wanted to understand, what does it mean to go from one to the other, and will it really work? And so I got into simulation, and that got me into the technology part.
Very interesting. So at the same time, while diving into technology, and this is more of an intermezzo question, I would call it. So you also are getting started teaching and working at universities. So was it always a passion you wanted to follow, or was it just an emerging hobby at that time?
Both. So if any of the personality tests that I've taken, I usually end up with two strengths. One is like a pioneer, like your podcast, innovation, doing new things. And then the other is a teacher or instructor, something like that. So it seems that I like to create new things and then show people how to use them or do it, what we're doing with scmBLOX. And so part of being the manager of TQM, I had a lot of classes. So I ended up developing a lot of quality-based classes and then delivering those to people in a corporate setting. And so in my work life, I was doing it. But also, I played sports when I was younger, and now my daughters were young. And so I was coaching their soccer teams and volleyball teams. And so I really liked that coaching. Eventually in life, I started doing management consulting. And again, so it's interesting how so many things are related to that. And in fact, that's why I'm getting my DBA, my doctorate in business administration. You need a doctorate to be able to teach at a university. So when I retire from work, I want to go teach at a university.
You already hinted at it, but this multifaceted career that you're going on, right? We talked about quality management, working in supply chain, operational risk management, technology, data and analytics, simulations, but then consulting, as you already hinted at, was another great passion of yours and another facet of your work life. So it was for companies like PwC, it can't get any bigger. What was some of the most interesting things you were able to consult on that combined all the passions we already talked about, from quality, supply chain, technology, and risk?
Yeah, there's one that kind of stands out that sort of pulled everything together, and that was a large project that we did for the Army, the United States Army, for a fleet of helicopters. And they were looking at, for various reasons, obviously can't discuss details, but they were looking at this critical system within the whole composite helicopter frame, this certain system that they were, and in fact, we used an early version of scmBLOX on this project. But the Army was having issues with the availability of this critical system. And you had the prime contractor, a defense contractor, like a Raytheon or a Boeing or whoever it was that makes the system, is the OEM of that system. And then you've also got what they call depots, these places that are doing repairs or overhauls, they sometimes call them. And so sometimes work is going to the prime contractor to fix, or you're getting new ones, or work is going to these depots, or there are spares. So there's a lot going on in this system. And we were able to show them that there were a couple of supply chains, one from the prime contractor and one from these depots, that sort of collapsed and came to a choke point. And that was a new realization. But once we got there, it's okay, everyone panicked a little bit, but we did some analysis. It was this steel forging company. So a lot of the different components were all being forged by this. The steel was being forged at this company, and here it is going to all these different parts of the supply chain. No one knew that those supply chains shared. So there was a fear. There were things changing in the way they were going to use this fleet, that they wondered, they really thought they were going to have to go back to Congress, the United States Congress, and ask for more money to buy more systems, because they didn't have enough systems of this critical system to do what they wanted to do, or what they expected to do over the next decade. So this is a very long analysis that we're looking at. The work didn't take a decade, but our simulations were on the order of a decade. And so we were able to show that they had data that said they were plunging down. The inventory was going down. And so they did this statistical analysis that said that trend keeps going, we're going to run out. But we were able to show them, no, actually, you got enough in the system that begins to curve. You just haven't, everything hasn't played through the system. All the orders that you already have out there, all the inventories that are already out there, all the changes that you expect will allow this to flatten, and you'll actually be okay for the length of time that you think, and you'll have the safety buffer that you want to have. And so we help them avoid going to Congress for $900 million and probably a 1.5 to 2 year delay while they waited for this money to get approved and allocated. And there's a whole process with the U.S. government. Anyway, so that was very interesting because it combined quality, the trouble they were having with some of these systems, the risk of are we going to make it, and what do we need to do, along with, again, supply chain and technology using, like I said, the early version of scmBLOX. And so it was a very interesting project, and we enjoyed it, had some great results on it.
You already talked about it, scmBLOX, your current company that you founded and now are the CEO for. It's a strategic planning simulation tool for supply chains. As you already said, you used an early version in your project. It feels to me personally, looking at everything that we just talked about, like a perfect combination of everything in your work experience ever. So how did that journey actually start?
It's interesting. You're right. So it's a perfect combination. We're looking at systems, we're using simulation, we're talking about the structure of the system, the structure of the supply chain. And so when I formed the company, we were looking for areas. Again, we like to do this kind of simulation that we call structural modeling or structural simulation instead of statistical. Two different approaches, and it's fun to get into the details of them. But like the beer game, for those that are familiar with the beer game, one of the things the beer game teaches, the main lesson is that the structure of the system, in this case, a supply chain, the structure of the system guides the behavior. So in the beer game, we end up seeing the bullwhip effect, and it doesn't matter who plays it. You could play it, I could play it, a CEO of some large company could play it, a high school student could play it. It doesn't really matter. The results are the same. And so the individuals don't matter as much as the structure of the system that generates all that. So we are very oriented towards systems and structure. So we were looking, when we formed the company, looking for areas where structure would have an impact. The structure of a system would have an impact. And so that got us into supply chain. And again, we we're familiar with the beer game and we're in that same field. And so it was a natural extension to say, if we saw that in the beer game, let's just create that bigger and more complex so that we can handle bigger real world problems. And so that's where it came from.
Essentially, what scmBLOX does today is looking at really complex supply chain networks, right?
Mhm.
So can you maybe talk a little bit about the features and functionalities, because it sounds super interesting.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about scmBLOX, I mentioned structural versus statistical. In structural modeling, looks at the cause and effect causal structure of the system that you're looking at. And that means the feedback loops of how are you controlling inventory control, feedback loops, delays in the system, shipping delays, things like that, as opposed to statistical modeling, where statistical modeling looks at data and it makes inferences and decisions about the system based on data. So it really doesn't care what the system was doing. It treats the system like a black box and says, I can do everything with just the data that I see from the system. And that's good in some situations, just like hammer and screwdriver, different tools for different jobs. That's good for some things, but the structural orientation lifts the top off that black box and says, we're going to actually look at the activities that occur, and then we'll figure out the data later. We'll make sure this matches data, but data isn't actually necessary to create the model. So it's a very different way. So what we do with scmBLOX is build that structure of a supply chain top to bottom. So wherever you are, down to however many layers you need. And a lot of people say, I don't know who's in my supply chain. As a starting point, you can just look at the bill of material, because very often the supply chain mirrors the bill of material. And so you can say, I don't know who my supplier is, but I guarantee I've got a supplier that supplies this and it has 3 components and I've got 3 suppliers doing that. And so you can build that up and begin to learn the delays in the system with some real simple assumptions. So yeah, it ends up being a very powerful approach that is not data intensive at all. And within a matter of really minutes or hours of building a model, you're already gaining insights into some of the risks and some of the things that can happen.
Interesting. I also have another question, because obviously we talked about the perfect culmination of scmBLOX with your past experience. When you think back to your fresh graduate self, have you ever imagined that this would be the path that because it's a really winding road, right? What was your expectation versus what is a reality? And was it better that it wasn't maybe as planned and just happened?
Yeah, so I said I went to MIT. System dynamics, which is a lot of the simulation modeling that we do, was invented at MIT. Way back again before my time, but I did not know that. I did not read the FIT discipline or get introduced to system dynamics. It was literally the year after I graduated that I read the book and saw that. And I thought, oh my gosh, I was right there at MIT. I could have walked down the hall and been with all the experts in the field. And so I do miss that. But at the same time, because it was fresh, one of the things, when you're in college, you always don't pay the most attention sometimes, or, you get distracted and all that. And so I think if I would try to do that in college, I would not have paid as much attention. So as an adult, I was coming back to it saying, I'm very interested in this and I want to learn more. And so on my own, did all that learning. And so, yeah, I think it worked out all right.
Yeah. But it's funny, right? Because you might have started in one place and then ended up totally somewhere else. So
Yeah.
it's a good journey. Okay. Let's talk about something that you mentioned a couple of times, but now let's talk about the improved version. Everybody in supply chain has heard about the beer game, I believe. If you haven't, then you should actually. But you are offering something that I find very intriguing, and it's even free of charge. It's a beer games on steroids.
Yeah.
So can you maybe elaborate on that project a little bit?
Yeah. So Beer Game on Steroids is a free version of scmBLOX that we provide universities and colleges to use in their courses. And really, we're opening it to anybody that wants to use it. We've got a LinkedIn page, Beer Game on Steroids, where you can go and get all the file. You can get a link to the installation file. You can get tutorials and example lesson plans, whatever you want to do. So you can do all that. Yeah, free, completely free. The idea was using it in universities in their classes, because you talk about a lot of these things and now you want to see them in action. And it actually uses, if you're familiar with system dynamics, there's someone in the field, Dr. John Sturman, who's the top person in the field, been there the longest, been doing a lot. And we use one of his real simple models from one of his books. We have his permission. And that, again, is also why we do it for free. It's just this public domain kind of thing. The on steroids part is that we go beyond the simple beer game. The beer game is 4 entities. I've got a retailer, a wholesaler, a distributor, a distributor, wholesaler, and then the factory that makes the beer. So it's a real kind of small and limited example system. But with the on steroids part means you can actually have 50 entities all interacting and combining in really long supply chains or short ones, or 3 supply chains combining into one, competitors, stealing your orders and things like that. So you can do a lot more, and it's not really the game anymore. The idea is you start with the game because, like you said, a lot of people in supply chain do that. And so a lot of classes use that as part of their curriculum. We start with, and I've used this in courses as well. I'm an adjunct at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I've used this there in risk management courses. And so you start with the beer game, and you learn from that. You do the debrief, and you understand the structure, guides behavior, and all this, and you see the bullwhip effect. So then we use beer game on steroids, and we rebuild it so the students see, yeah, exactly what happened to us. We can see that happen. And then we start building and adding on and saying, well, what if there were 2 more tiers in the supply chain? What if we had extra inventory over here? What do these kinds of things do? What if there was a whole other similar supply chain and now had the choice of, where I wanted to get my orders from? So it takes the concept, a lot of the things that we do with SCM blocks, and it's a simpler version of that, where you're not worried about a bill of material. A lot of these other things that we do in SCM blocks, much more complicated models. But anyway, you get the chance to use that. You get the feel for this structural modeling that I talked about.
That's pretty cool. Also, beer, obviously, there's a lot more than just the beer producer, the retailer, and so on, because there's hop, there's wheat, there's a lot of things that you can just add to that. German beer market is, by the way, very competitive. A lot of breweries and declining demand because people are more and more looking for alcohol-free options.
Oh, that's true.
So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is an interesting market for sure. Yeah.
Let's go to the next question, which is the future of supply chains. I want to ask this question because I personally think you have a very unique view on this because you're so system oriented. You're really looking at supply chains from a different lens because you come from a different angle. So I find that to be extremely interesting. So what do you think are maybe new trends on the horizon, and what might be something innovative that nobody has thought about that you think should be part of supply chain management?
Definitely. I definitely have thoughts along these lines. So I would say that sort of up till now, most approaches in the supply chain world have been more company centric, like within a company, making sure sales talks to operations and all these sorts of integrating these functions, but it's within a company. And so when we say end to end supply chain in that world, end to end is very limited. In fact, I use the term side to side because all it really is looking at my supplier, my tier 1, my company, my distribution centers, my customers, moving from my supplier. I get an order from a customer. I issue a purchase order to a supplier. I track that. So all these systems, and they're great at doing that. That's great, but it's within the company. And it tends to, in that view, we tend to try to optimize all these internal operations, and it's very tactical. But from the systems view, we've learned that if you optimize the part of a system, you actually sub-optimize the entire system, as each individual entity in that system tries to do its best. It does that at the harm of other elements or other parts of the system. And so you end up being sub-optimized. And that's one of the most interesting things with the systems view for me, is that even with the best intentions, we're not trying to sabotage, we're not trying to do poorly, but even with the best intentions, we can get bad results, like the beer game. Again, the beer game is such a good example, a simple example, but everything that we try to do in the larger sense with SCM blocks is all captured in that beer game, where everyone's trying to do their best, but they're operating only by themselves. And so the whole system is sub-optimized. But anyway, this concept that no matter, we all want to do well and we're all trying to do well, we can still get bad results. So the current view tends to be very myopic and short-term and cost-oriented, efficiency-oriented. You hear a lot about optimization and things like that. But COVID and these more recent disruptions, name Red Sea, Panama Canal, any of these kinds of things are showing that this approach doesn't work. It's too brittle. We're too far on the efficiency end of the spectrum. So there's this growing recognition that there's this other end of the spectrum that we're going to call resiliency or responsiveness. And you can't be completely efficient and completely resilient. Those are opposite. You can be somewhere in between. And what we're realizing is we got to get off this extreme of efficiency and move more into the middle and begin to lift our head and have a strategic view, so that now end to end really means top to bottom of the supply chain. So what we do with scmBLOX is goes deep, tier 1, 2, 3, tier N, raw materials or whatever. But with that systems view, we have this recognition that no company is an island. We're always dependent on everyone else. If I order 100 from my supplier, the only way they're going to give me 100 is if their supplier gave them 100 and their supplier gave them 100. Focusing only on ourselves is a very limited view of the world and limits our ability to really do well. So there's this desire now for more resiliency, and resiliency is a system phenomenon. You're not resilient as yourself. Yeah, in some degree you are, but what you want is this whole system to be able to respond, react, recover. And again, on this spectrum of this efficiency and resiliency on these extreme ends, we're learning that there needs to be this balance. We can't be both of them. We have to treat the supply chain as a system now and begin to appreciate that we've got to do things that may not be highly efficient, but they're going to buy us some responsiveness or adaptability or resilience, whatever term you want to use. They'll buy us that for the future at the expense. It's like insurance. If you pay for insurance in case something bad happens, we're going to have extra inventory in case something bad happens. And so this drive to really squeeze out every bit of inventory, just as an example, can be a very brittle solution that works only under very limited cases. And what we've got this, again, growing recognition is we need to expand and appreciate that we want these systems to be resilient.
That's a good one. And also, your answer gave me a perfect segue to my last question, which is always my hobby question, because do you know where you need a very good and responsive system where everything has to work together in order to win?
Probably just about any sport, but volleyball is my big sport now. I started off playing soccer when I was younger and then got into volleyball in college. And so I played that. Maybe don't play it as much as I'd like to anymore. Now it's more coaching and watching the Olympics just happen. And that was a lot of fun. But yeah, if you just think about that, a very simple breakdown of volleyball is you bump or you pass the ball to a setter who sets the ball, and then a hitter comes through and hits it. Well, you start with that end in mind. You want a good set to the hitter so that they have a great chance of scoring. If the set's not good, it's going to be difficult for that hitter to do something. If the pass isn't good to the setter, so the setter can make a good set, then there's going to be a problem there. And so it all begins at the front of that chain of when I first start, I pass that ball. It's got to be a good pass so the setter can make a good set, so the hitter can make a good hit. And it's actually some of what I teach. We actually use the term system in volleyball. You're in system, meaning everything's flowing and all that, or you're out of system, meaning you're not able to do that. And so when I coach younger players, we talk about that and having that system of, view of a system and that appreciation that A has to happen so B can happen so C can happen. And anyway, it's fun. So I coach a lot of boys here in Texas and learning from that. Yeah, it's a good, again, systems. I like things about systems, and it plays into the sport of volleyball very much.
And is there any analogy to supply chain risk management in volleyball as well? Just curious.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Again, I'll just take that chain right there, or even starting further back. We're on defense now. And so the other team is attacking, and how you set up your defense gives you the highest probability of you making the right play. So if you're all scattered and you don't have good positions and you're not where you're supposed to be, then it's tough to defend. So you get everyone in those places, and that's where it starts. That's the foundation. Now you make a play, and now we're able to recover, and we get a set, and we turn around, and now we're attacking back. And it's that, I use the terms resilience, adaptability, responsiveness, being able to adapt and put yourself in a position so you can adapt. That's probably the biggest thing. And when you think about supply chains, that's what we need to do. And hopefully there's this growing interest in doing that more, of putting ourselves in the position so that we can adapt when we need to. Not that we will always have to adapt, but we're ready and properly equipped and can do it when we need to do it.
That was beautiful. So with that, I would say thank you so much, because we're unfortunately at the end, but I personally learned a lot today about systems, about SCM blocks, actually also about volleyball and supply chain risk management.
There you
So
go.
thank you, Chris, for doing this with me today.
You bet. Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been great. Thank you.
Perfect. And to everybody who's listening, watching, or however you actually look at this podcast, I want to say thank you so much for your attention. And we just finish it by saying bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This was Supply Chain Pioneers. Thanks for watching, listening, or however you are enjoying this podcast. You can find Supply Chain Pioneers on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all other major podcast players, as well as on YouTube at Ulf Talk Supply Chain. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you next time.